Why does our National Defense Act have Ukraine spending in it, including cluster bombs? Perhaps you don't know, but we stopped using cluster bombs in the 60s and 70s because they have a huge failure rate. Maybe 60% of them go off. They definitely kill a lot of people, but everyone that doesn't detonate lands on the ground and is now just waiting. In Laos, there are still injuries to this day when random undetonated bombs are found and they can still go off. And here we are sending ammunitions we don't have and spending dollars we don't own to help Ukraine under our National Defense Authorization Act. Ukraine is not a state in America. It is not part of our nation. Ukraine is a neutral zone, and it should be. Now you're probably going to disagree with me because war is murder. I don't support sending weapons to Ukraine to kill Russians, especially when you see how Russians are treating Ukrainians versus how Ukrainians are treating Russians. However, even if you do think we should support this bill, if you do feel that we should be supporting Ukraine, even if it's sacrificing our own ammunition storage and causing inflation through sending money over there, is it a ridiculous idea to at least separate those spending bills from our National Defense Authorization Act? It doesn't seem honest. If you're going to do it, don't hide it and don't chain it to national defense. Make it its own thing so that way it can actually be discussed in its own merit and not connected with our National Defense Authorization Act. Thankfully, the Freedom Caucus is always here to make amendments, and today it's Matt Gaetz. Let's jump into the amendments he wants to add to this act.
The final basket that I want to talk about is Ukraine. My amendment 1206 strips all the Ukraine money out of this bill, about $300 million. And what I think you've heard from people who feel strongly on the Ukraine issue is that these should be divided questions. I know that I'm in the minority of the majority with my view on the Ukraine war. I'm in the minority when it comes to the overall House of Representatives. But this issue of whether or not the United States should continue to be involved in this war in Ukraine should not be commingled with these other critical questions about how we're going to operate the Department of Defense. Whether you're for the war in Ukraine or you're against the war in Ukraine and the U.S. involvement, it at least is an issue that deserves its own dignity and its own vote. And the National Defense Authorization Act should not have to carry the Ukraine funding as an anchor. There's a second Ukraine amendment that I have that's a bit more targeted, Amendment number 326, and this deals with end-use monitoring. Okay, so when we had the Inspector General before us and we asked questions in the committee, are we complying with end-use monitoring when it comes to Ukraine? They could not answer the question yes. So the only thing that Amendment 326 requires is a certification by the Secretary of Defense that we are following our own laws when it comes to end-use monitoring of this equipment. We know we haven't done it right the whole time. I think we should at least have to certify that we're following the law as we're sending weapons of war into a killing zone. And the final amendment I'll ask you to support is one where I join my colleague, Ms. Jacobs, and the ranking member of the Rules Committee to stop the exportation of cluster bombs. Mr. McGovern had a freestanding piece of legislation on this that I think correctly laid out what the international norms are regarding cluster bombs. And as I've heard our colleagues who support this decision defend cluster bombs, it seems to fall into two categories. One, well, Russia's using them and has them. If just because Russia has something, we're going to give it to Ukraine, what are we going to send tactical nuclear weapons next? Since the point that my colleague Mr. Davidson made, is the objective here to get Ukraine on some sort of military parity with Russia? If so, the cluster bombs would seem like a bizarre place to start anyway. And then the second argument made in favor of the cluster bombs is, well, they're only going to use them in their own country. How craven and depraved is that? We are still cleaning up cluster bombs now in Laos because of the high dud rate. These things go down, and you're going to have children with lost limbs and parents that they don't have anymore because of this decision. And the fact that a country is willing to use it within their own boundaries in no way absolves us of the responsibility of sending them there when those folks die. So I hope you'll consider that as a bipartisan amendment as well, and I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Those all seem very rational, not hyperbolic, and giving Ukraine the dignity it deserves. We really have to appreciate the Freedom Caucus. They're one of the few people doing work like this. Yes, we will try to advocate why the Ukraine war is immoral, a bad idea politically, the historical inaccuracies that the government is telling you. However, we agree with your freedom to advocate one way or the other. We have to be adults and we have to separate these conversations. We can't let our government keep spending this. We know the military-industrial complex exists. We know they love war. And we know our government will keep taking money from the Fed to pay for this. It is hurting America, and it's not helping the world. It's not even helping Ukraine. It's just helping a bunch of rich politicians and corporatists and people who are willing to wage war for profit. That's not capitalism. It's authoritarianism. If you haven't gone to the Freedom Caucus site yet, you've got to go. Donate, support your local representative. And if you're in a state that doesn't currently have someone in the Freedom Caucus, start letting people know. If every state had Freedom Caucus members, we would have a very loud minority. And that's all we need. We can do this one step at a time. This is not Republicans versus Democrats. It's not liberals versus conservatives. This is the people versus the federal government. And we can no longer allow them to use America as their way of enriching themselves while hurting other people. Period. It's not what America was built for. It's not what it's based on. And it's not a good goal. I hope you learned something. I'm Tristan with Radically Rational Radio. Like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you in the next episode. Stay resilient.